Elvis Presley fell in love more than once, but there was one relationship, one specific, hidden, painfully real connection that the history books have mostly glossed over. Not because it wasn't important, because it was almost too important, too raw, too honest, too much of a window into the man behind the myth. The people who knew about it kept quiet for decades out of respect, out of love, out of the understanding that some truths, once spoken aloud, change everything. This is that truth. And once you hear it, you will never see Elvis Presley quite the same way again. Section 1. The Boy Who Loved Too Deeply. Music settles. Warm, slow, southern evening light in every note. Before we talk about who Elvis loved, we have to talk about how he loved. Because the way Elvis Presley loved people was not ordinary. It was not casual or guarded or measured in the careful way that most people learn to measure their feelings after they've been hurt a few times. Elvis loved the way he sang, with everything, all the way open, nothing held back, nothing in reserve. His mother used to say that Elvis felt other people's pain as if it were his own, that he would come home from school as a small boy and describe the sadness on a classmate's face with the kind of detail that made Gladys stop what she was doing and really listen. He noticed people. He paid attention in the way that most of us are too distracted or too self-protective to pay attention. That quality, that radical openness to other human beings, is part of what made him extraordinary on a stage. When Elvis sang a love song, audiences didn't feel like they were being performed at. They felt like they were being spoken to. Directly. Personally. Like he had somehow reached across the footlights and found the specific ache inside each individual person in the room. But that same quality in his private life made loving him a complicated and often heartbreaking experience, because a man who feels everything that deeply doesn't come with simple edges. He comes with the full weight of himself, and not everyone, no matter how much they love him, is built to hold that weight forever. Priscilla knew this better than anyone. But this story isn't only about Priscilla. This story is about the woman most people have never heard of, the relationship that happened in the space between the public marriage and the public decline, the connection that, by almost every account from those who witnessed it, was the closest Elvis Presley ever came, after his mother, to being truly, completely, dangerously known by another person. Her name was Linda Thompson, and what happened between them is one of the most quietly devastating love stories in American history. To understand Linda, you first have to understand what came before her, what broke before she arrived to help put the pieces back together. Elvis met Priscilla Beaulieu in Germany in 1959 while he was stationed there with the army. She was 14 years old. He was 24. By the standards of the time in the American South, the age difference raised fewer eyebrows than it would today. Though looking back, the gap in experience and power between them was enormous. He was already the most famous entertainer on earth. She was a teenager from an Air Force family, dazzled by a man who existed in a category entirely beyond normal life. Elvis was drawn to her immediately. But the nature of that attraction has always been complicated to examine honestly. Those who knew him well have said that part of what Elvis loved about Priscilla, at least in the beginning, was that she was unformed, young enough that he could participate in shaping who she became. He had her brought to Graceland under the strict supervision of her parents. He paid for her schooling in Memphis. He was, in the language of the people around him, creating something, crafting a version of a partner that fit the very specific shape of what he needed. That is not entirely a love story. That is also, in part, a loneliness story. They married in 1967. Lisa Marie was born in 1968, and within a few years, the marriage was fracturing along fault lines that had been there from the very beginning. Priscilla has been honest about this. more honest over the decades than she perhaps needed to be. She has said that Elvis, once she was truly his wife, lost interest in her in a physical sense, that he had this idea of a Madonna figure, a pure, untouchable woman, and that once she was the mother of his child, she crossed some internal threshold in his mind that he couldn't move past. He sought intimacy elsewhere, with other women, casually, the way powerful, famous men sometimes did in that era, and were rarely held accountable for. And Priscilla, who had given up her entire young life to be at Graceland, who had waited and adapted and become exactly what was asked of her, Priscilla found her own path out. She fell in love with her karate instructor. She asked Elvis for a divorce in 1972. He didn't see it coming. The people who were there that day say Elvis was destroyed by it. Not just hurt, not just wounded, destroyed in the way that only something you never genuinely prepared for can destroy you. He had always believed, on some fundamental level, that Priscilla would be there. She was the constant. She was Graceland in human form. And when she walked out the door, the whole structure of his private world shook in a way it never fully recovered from. He needed someone to catch him. Linda Thompson caught him. Linda Thompson was 22 years old when she met Elvis in 1972. She was a former Miss Tennessee, a young woman of genuine warmth and wit, and a remarkable, emotional steadiness that set her apart from almost everyone else in Elvis's orbit. She wasn't dazzled by the fame the way others were. She seemed to see through it or around it to the actual person living underneath all that legend. They fell into each other immediately. Within weeks of meeting, Linda had moved into Graceland. She was there through the dark middle years, the years of declining health, of escalating medication, of concerts that were becoming harder and harder to watch. She was there at 3 in the morning when the night terrors came. She was there when Elvis couldn't breathe right, when the medications had tilted his chemistry into something frightening, when he needed someone to simply sit beside him and not panic and not leave. She did not panic. She did not leave. For 4 years, Linda Thompson was the heartbeat of Elvis Presley's private life. She has spoken about those years in interviews that are remarkable for their honesty and their absence of bitterness. She describes a man of extraordinary tenderness, a man who would write her poems, who called her by private pet names, who told her things in the dark that he never said to anyone else. She describes sitting with him through medical emergencies that would have sent most people running for the door and choosing every single time to stay. She stayed because she loved him. But she also carried something in those years that she has only described carefully, in the measured language of a person who has spent a long time making peace with a complicated truth. She carried fear, real, constant, exhausting fear. The fear of what the morning might bring, the fear of what the medications were doing, the fear of the phone call she knew, somewhere in the back of every quiet moment, was eventually coming. Living with someone whose life is in danger every day is its own kind of grief. You mourn them while they're still there. You practice the loss so many times in your mind that when it finally arrives, and Linda knew it would arrive, you are both completely prepared and completely devastated. But here is the hidden truth, the part of this story that makes it so unbearably human. Linda Thompson tried to save Elvis Presley, not publicly, not dramatically, in the quiet, persistent, unglamorous way that love sometimes expresses itself, through showing up, through hard conversations, through refusing to pretend that everything is fine when everything is clearly not fine. She talked to people. She raised alarms. She pushed against the wall of enablement that surrounded him, that comfortable, well-paid, deeply loyal wall of people who told Elvis what he wanted to hear. And she said repeatedly that something had to change. And nobody changed anything. In 1976, Linda Thompson left Elvis Presley. She has never spoken about it without pain, not anger, which is what you might expect from a woman who gave 4 of the hardest years of her life to someone and watched it break anyway. Just pain. The clean, honest kind that comes from loving something real and losing it in real time. She left because she was disappearing. That is the quiet, rarely examined truth at the center of their story. The people closest to Elvis, the ones who loved him most genuinely, had a tendency to lose themselves in the enormity of his need. His world had a gravity that pulled everything toward him: his schedule, his moods, his health crises, his 3 a.m. piano sessions, his need to be entertained and distracted and soothed. There was always something. There was always a reason the people around him couldn't attend to their own lives. Linda, at 26 years old, looked at herself and realized she had set herself completely aside. That the woman she had been when she walked into Graceland had become someone else entirely. Someone organized around Elvis's survival rather than her own life. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she loved herself just enough, just barely enough to go. Elvis, when she told him, reportedly held her for a long time without speaking. He didn't argue. He didn't beg, though the people who were nearby say his eyes said everything that his voice didn't. He held her, and he told her he understood, and he told her that he loved her. She believed him. She has always believed him. What Linda Thompson has said in the decades since, in interviews given carefully, sparingly, with the gravity of someone who understands the weight of what they're carrying, is that leaving Elvis Presley was the hardest thing she ever did. Not because she didn't know it was right, but because she knew, with a certainty she could never fully explain, that he would not survive much longer without someone like her beside him. She was right. He had 14 months left. After Linda left, Elvis began seeing Ginger Alden, a young woman he had met through his Memphis connections, beautiful and kind, but 20 years his junior and wholly unprepared for the reality of what she had stepped into. Ginger was not Linda. Nobody who came after Linda was Linda. Those who were at Graceland in those final months describe a man who had become even more untethered. The night hours stretched longer. The medications multiplied. The man who had once made an entire country feel something every time he opened his mouth now sometimes sat in silence for hours, not reading, not watching television, not speaking, just sitting in whatever room he'd wandered into, present in body, but somewhere else entirely in spirit. He called Linda sometimes, late at night, the way people call the ones they trust when the darkness gets heavy. She took his calls. She always took his calls. She has said that even after she left, she never stopped being afraid for him. That the fear she had carried for 4 years didn't go away just because she walked out the door. It followed her home. It sat with her in her new life. It woke her up at night. She was not at Graceland when he died. When she heard the news on August 16th, 1977, she was somewhere else, living the life she had chosen to go find. And she has described that moment, hearing those words on the radio or the television or wherever the news reached her, as something that split time in two, before and after, like all the worst losses do. Elvis Presley was buried with a ring on his finger. He was buried at Forest Hills Cemetery, moved later to the meditation garden at Graceland, placed beside his mother the way he had always, in some wordless private way, wanted to be. Linda Thompson did not attend the funeral. She has explained that in the simple, honest language of someone who understands her own grief well enough to not dress it up. She said she couldn't, that there was no version of standing in that crowd, in that heat, at that graveside, that she could have survived intact. So she said goodbye in her own way, in her own time, in her own private space. That is not weakness. That is self-knowledge, and it is something Elvis himself never quite managed to find. Here is what this story is really about. Underneath all the details and the dates and the names, underneath the Graceland gates and the prescriptions and the jumpsuits and the sold out arenas. Elvis Presley spent his entire life being loved by people who were not equipped to love him in the way he needed. Not because they didn't try, not because they were bad or selfish or cruel, but because what Elvis needed was something that no single human being can provide for another: the ability to make the loneliness stop, the ability to replace what was lost, the ability to be, for one full grown man, everything that a mother is to a child. Gladys had been that for him, and when she died, the hole she left was not a shape that any other love could fill. Linda came the closest. Linda, with her steadiness and her honesty and her refusal to pretend. Linda, who stayed when it was terrifying and left only when staying was swallowing her whole. Linda, who loved him enough to be honest and loved herself enough to survive. She has lived a full life since then. She has been married. She has had children. She has built something real and lasting and hers. She speaks about Elvis with love, not bitterness, with grief, not regret, with the particular tenderness of someone who knew a person at their most unguarded, their most frightened and most real, and chose to stay as long as they possibly could. That is not a small thing. That is not a footnote in somebody else's story. That is its own kind of heroism. And Elvis, who never stopped being the boy from Tupelo who felt everything too deeply, who needed too much, who loved like it was the only thing keeping him alive. Elvis deserved to be loved like that, deserved someone like that beside him. He had her for 4 years. 4 years in a life that lasted 42. It wasn't enough time. It was never going to be enough time. But it was real. And in the end, in the quiet final accounting of a life like his, real is the rarest and most precious thing there is. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who believes in love that doesn't make the highlight reel. Subscribe for more stories about the real people behind the legends.